I want you to take a moment and just reflect on the sheer number of interactive products you use every single day.
Hmm,
We're talking about everything: your smartphone, your fitness tracker, the self checkout at the grocery store, even that coffee machine in the office.
right.
Now, why is it that some of these, like your favorite app, are just a genuine pleasure to use? They feel smooth,
Hmm.
intuitive.
Joyful even.
Exactly. While others, like a baffling ticket machine that makes you start all over again after one mistake, are just completely infuriating.
Well, that gap, that chasm between delight and frustration is exactly what we're going to get into in our deep dive today.
Okay.
Our mission is to really unpack the foundational principles of what's called interaction design, or ID. We're going to systematically look at what separates good design from poor design, define what ID even is, and how it relates to fields like human-computer interaction.
And outline the goals that lead to a great user experience.
Precisely. The critical goals and principles you need to get there.
And it seems like we need this framework now more than ever. I mean, according to the source material we looked at, we are kind of stuck in a rut.
A serious one.
Yeah, Alan Cooper, a huge figure in the UX world, he points out that so much of the software we use today is plagued by the exact same interaction errors that existed 20 years ago.
And his big example is the undo option.
The undo option. It's inexplicable that so many new apps still fail to include something so basic. He actually calls this pattern unforgivable.
And that failure is why interaction design is so vital. This is about more than just making things look pretty. It's about systematically stamping out that annoyance and maximizing efficiency and, well, enjoyment.
So let's start with a classic, universally frustrating example of poor design:
Yeah.
the hotel voicemail system.
Oh, this one is painful.
You get to your room, you see that blinking red light, and it's practically screaming at you that you have a message. But how do you actually get to it?
Right, so you pick up the handset, you hear a dial tone, and immediately you have no idea what to do. There's no visibility.
You have to hunt for that little instruction card next to the phone.
And it says something like, press 41 for messages. So you do that, and a robot voice says, please enter the room number for which you would like to leave a message.
Which is the opposite of what you want. So you look down again, okay, different instructions, touch star, your room number, and then hash.
You follow all those steps, and the system says, you have reached the mailbox for room 106. To listen to your message, type in your password.
And now you're stuck again. Is the password your room number, the phone's extension? What is it?
It's just a chain of confusion. It's so inefficient, taking 6 or more steps just to get a single piece of information, and it completely fails on visibility. You know that you have a message, but not who it's from or how many, until you finally get through that whole process.
So let's contrast that awful experience with a classic piece of good design: the marble answering machine. This was created by Durrell Bishop.
I love this example. This machine used the physical world. So when a message was recorded, a little marble, a physical marble, would roll down a chute that you could see.
So right away, you know how many messages you have.
Exactly. At a glance, you just see the stack of marbles. The design used a physical object to represent digital data,
Right.
which is something we immediately understand.
And interacting with it was just as simple.
It was. The core tasks, like playing the message or calling the person back, only took one step. You'd place the marble into a little dent that was clearly marked for that action.
It's efficient, looks good, and it's intuitive.
It is, but, and this is a key point, context matters. An elegant design like this would be completely impractical in a public hotel. There's no security. Anyone could listen to the messages.
That idea of bad physical design brings us right to another disaster: the typical remote control, which designers say suffers from buttonitis.
Buttonitis, yeah, it's that overwhelming mess of tiny cluttered buttons that makes doing anything a chore.
The classic TiVo remote, though, is held up as a great example of ID. It was the complete opposite of that mess.
If you can picture it, it has this distinctive peanut shape that just fits perfectly in your hand. And that wasn't an accident. It was engineered through a user-centered design process to feel good.
And crucially, they used restraint.
Yes. They limited the physical buttons to only the essentials: play, pause, record, and moved everything else to the on-screen menu. They really thought about the weight, the feel, the placement, all of it.
So if we fast forward to today, the modern interaction problem has shifted a bit, especially with smart TVs where we're sitting far away.
And the early solutions were just terrible, like that slow on-screen grid keyboard where you have to move a cursor to select each letter one by one.
Ugh, even the slightly better ones, like on some Apple TVs where you swipe along a single line of letters, it can be so frustrating. If you overshoot the letter you want, you have to swipe all the way back across the whole alphabet again.
It makes entering a password an absolute nightmare. And this is exactly why we're seeing this big push toward voice control, linking an Amazon Echo to your TV.
But that has its own problems.
It does. Do you really want to say your password out loud in a crowded living room? Or verify your age? This all points to a core concept: designing for activity. The right design depends entirely on whether the interface needs to be fun, like a game, or super secure and trustworthy, like your online banking app.
Which might even mean future solutions like biometrics built into the remote.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, so let's get the formal definition that really ties all of this together. Interaction design is defined as designing interactive products to support the way people communicate and interact in their everyday and working lives.
It's about making things that actually enhance how we operate. The computer scientist Terry Winograd put it really nicely. He said it's about designing spaces for human communication.
And what makes ID so powerful is that it is, by its very nature, multidisciplinary.
It really is. It pulls from 4 core academic disciplines: psychology or cognitive science,
Computer science.
design, and engineering. But it also borrows heavily from practices like industrial design, graphic design, and even the film industry for storytelling.
And where these areas meet, you get these really important interdisciplinary fields, like computer-supported cooperative work or CSCW.
Right, and CSCW, for instance, is all about designing technology to help groups of people collaborate. This brings up the big comparison with HCI, or human-computer interaction.
How are they different?
While historically HCI was a bit narrower, it focused mostly on computing systems and their usability.
But that's changed, right?
It has. Today, HCI has expanded massively to cover things like social media, data mining. So there's now a huge practical overlap with ID, which was always meant to be a bit broader.
So given all those different fields, it's impossible for one person to be an expert in everything.
Exactly. You can't know cognitive psychology, back-end architecture, business goals,
Mm-hmm.
everything. So interaction design is ideally done by multidisciplinary teams. You might have engineers, designers, anthropologists, psychologists.
But that can cause its own problem.
It can. The big one is communication breakdown. Take the word representation. A computer scientist thinks about how data is stored. A graphic designer thinks about how it's displayed. A psychologist might think about how a user understands it.
So everyone's speaking a slightly different language.
And that can lead to confusion and conflict. It really takes strong leadership to bring all those different viewpoints together.
So all this work, all these different teams, it's all in service of one central concern: the user experience, or UX.
And UX is defined as how a product behaves and is used in the real world. It covers everything: the user's emotional reaction, their pleasure, their satisfaction, even the sensual details, like the perfect smooth feel when a knob turns.
There's a really important distinction here that the source material stresses. You can't design a user experience.
Right. The experience happens inside the user's mind.
As designers, we can only design for a user experience. We create the features and the attributes that we hope will evoke that desired feeling.
Exactly. If we design a device with a sleek, cool-to-the-touch metal case, we're designing features that aim to create a feeling of quality and satisfaction in the user's hand.
And the ultimate case study for this is the iPod phenomenon. When the classic iPod came out, it wasn't the cheapest, maybe not even the most functional device.
But it was a massive success because the total user experience was just phenomenal.
The sleek look, the simple click wheel interaction, it all created this sense of elegance and pleasure that nothing else had. One analyst even compared the device's experience to the well-managed feel of a physical Apple store.
There's a helpful model for this from Mark Hassenzel. He breaks UX into 2 parts: the pragmatic and the hedonic.
Pragmatic is just, does it work? Is it practical?
Pretty much. Is it simple and efficient for achieving your goals? The hedonic aspects are about the emotional side. Is the interaction stimulating, evocative, fun? A good UX needs a balance of both.
Okay, so if we're designing for everyone's experience, that has to include, well, everyone. This brings us to accessibility and inclusiveness.
Yes. So accessibility is about making a product usable for as many people as possible, and it has a traditional focus on people with disabilities. Inclusiveness is the bigger overarching idea of accommodating the widest possible range of people, period.
There's a really profound idea here, which is that disability is often seen not just as an impairment, but as the result of poor design.
Exactly. The design fails the person. It requires an interaction that someone physically or cognitively just can't perform. And what's fascinating is that some technologies we all use, like SMS messaging, actually began as solutions for accessibility challenges.
The source material classifies impairments into three main types.
Right. There are sensory impairments like vision or hearing loss, physical impairments like loss of function from an injury, and cognitive impairments, which could be learning difficulties or memory loss.
And it also classifies them by duration.
Which is just as important. There's permanent disability, like being a long-term wheelchair user, temporary, like having a broken wrist, and situational, like trying to hear instructions in a really noisy factory.
And this is a massive design priority for the future. I mean, the stats show that 80% of people will have some form of disability by the time they reach age 85.
Our designs absolutely have to accommodate an aging population.
But we are seeing some really exciting progress. The example of the athlete Amy Mullins shows how assistive tech is evolving.
The prosthetics are becoming fashion statements.
Exactly. They're moving beyond being just functional to being desirable, beautiful. It starts to blur the boundary between assistive devices and, well, just extensions of self.
So to design for this wide inclusion and quality experience, we need concrete goals. And this brings us to usability.
Usability is basically the set of metrics we use to make sure products are effective, efficient, and enjoyable. There are 6 specific goals.
First is effectiveness. Simply, how good is the product at doing what it's supposed to do?
Second, efficiency. How well does it support users in doing their tasks? Think about the one-step marble machine versus the 6-step voicemail. Amazon's one-click purchase is a perfect example of high efficiency.
Third is safety. This is all about protecting the user from making serious errors and helping them recover when they do.
So, not putting the delete all button right next to the save button.
Exactly. And providing that confirmation box. Are you sure you want to permanently delete this? That's a key safety mechanism.
Fourth is utility. Does the product provide the right kind of functionality for its audience? A powerful accounting software has high utility for an accountant, but not for a graphic designer.
Fifth, learnability. How easy is it to learn to use? People don't want to read manuals for everyday products. And finally, memorability. How easy is it to remember how to use, especially for things you don't do very often?
So those 6 goals, effectiveness, efficiency, safety, utility, learnability, and memorability, are the core of usability. But that's only half the story.
Correct. We still have the user experience goals, which are broader and more subjective. They're all about how a system feels. We want things to be satisfying, fun, motivating. And we want to avoid things being frustrating, annoying, or boring.
The source brings up the concept of flow, that state of intense involvement where you get so immersed in an activity that time just seems to vanish.
That's what designers of great video games and engaging websites are always chasing. And then there are the micro-interactions. These are the tiny little moments that have a huge impact.
Like the little sound the trash makes when you empty it.
Or the perfect glide of a volume knob. Getting those small details right is crucial.
But this focus on engagement can get tricky. Sometimes design goes beyond usability and into persuasion, trying to entice you to spend more time or money.
And that's where you can run into dark patterns. That's a term coined by Harry Brignall for deceptive practices designed to trick users.
Like when a website sneaks an extra item into your shopping cart and you have to hunt for the checkbox to remove it.
Or that infuriating process for unsubscribing from a mailing list. You click unsubscribe, but then you're taken to a page with multiple checkboxes in a survey. You're never quite sure if it worked. Ethical design demands that users can clearly opt in or opt out without any manipulation.
So, to meet all these goals, designers rely on a set of core design principles. These are like general rules or heuristics that guide their decisions.
The first one is visibility. It's pretty straightforward. The more visible functions are, the more you know what to do next. Don Norman's car analogy is perfect. The controls for headlights and indicators are right there, visible.
Contrast that with some modern automatic faucets where there are no visible controls at all, and they have to put up a sign to explain how to use it.
Exactly. The second principle is feedback. The system has to tell you immediately that your action was registered, whether that's a sound, a vibration, or a visual change. Without it, you get confused.
Third, constraints. These restrict the kinds of interaction that can happen.
This can be physical, like a cable only fitting into a port one way, or it can be graphical, like menu options being grayed out when they're not available. It guides the user by limiting their choices.
Fourth is consistency. This means using similar elements for similar tasks.
Right. If you use the same button to select things across different programs, it makes the whole system much easier to learn and use. It reduces the cognitive load.
But consistency isn't always the answer, and this is a really critical point. Jonathan Gruden used an analogy about storing knives.
Mm.
You keep butter knives in the drawer, carving knives in a block on the counter, and your best knives locked away. It's inconsistent, but it's actually easier to use because the tools are where you need them for a specific task.
That's a perfect illustration of context. And finally, there's affordance. And affordance is an attribute of an object that tells people how to use it. It gives a clue.
So a door handle affords pulling.
That's what Don Norman would call a real affordance. It's a physical property.
Mm.
For screen-based things, like an icon that looks like a button, he called it a perceived affordance. It's a convention we learn.
It's clear that applying all these principles is a constant balancing act. More constraints might mean less visibility. Focusing on aesthetics might hurt usability.
It's always about the trade-off.
Okay, so to wrap up, we've established that interaction design is this really rich, multidisciplinary field focused entirely on the user experience.
And achieving a great one means balancing those objective usability goals, like efficiency and safety, with the more subjective UX goals, like making something fun and engaging.
And it all relies on applying those core principles: visibility, feedback, constraints, consistency, and affordance.
And here's a final thought for you to take away based on our discussion today. The source material suggests simplicity as a key principle, that you should remove elements until a design nearly breaks. So if you were designing a new smart wearable and you were forced to make a trade-off to achieve that ultimate simplicity, which of the major goals we talked about, efficiency, safety, or fun, would you sacrifice first? And why?
Use that framework the next time you run into a really frustrating product and you'll know exactly what went wrong. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.